Good evening, friends. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to an Adda with the master storyteller, William Dalrymple, Flow Kolkata's first national event this year. William, we are so happy that you took out the time to be here with us today. Welcome to Flow Kolkata. Friends, even though I have been tasked with introducing today's speaker, William Dalrymple, I believe that he really doesn't need any introduction. Hi, William.
How are you? Nice
Very
to see you,
well.
Mr. Nira. Getting
Yes,
my
so
cup of tea ready for the next hour.
perfect. We're looking forward to having you here with us. So I'm going to
I'm
go
looking
ahead.
forward to speaking to you.
Perfect. He's a world-renowned historian and a writer. I'm talking about you, William. He's
No, I can
famous.
hear.
Yeah. He's famous for making history accessible to the common man. All his books have won multiple literary accolades and awards, including the Duff Cooper Memorial Award and the Hemingway Wolfson Prizes, and many more. His most recent book, The Anarchy, is a history of the Indian subcontinent during the collapse of the Mughal Empire, rise of the Marathas, the militarization, and the rise of the East India Company. And that is going to be the main point of discussion today. William is also a broadcaster and a critic. The television series Stones of the Raj and Indian Journeys, which William wrote and presented, won the Best Documentary Series at BAFTA 2002. He's an art historian and a curator. He has curated the show Forgotten Masters, Indian Paintings for the East India Company. This show showcased the beautiful and important works of Indian artists in UK. He has been a visiting fellow at the Princeton University and a distinguished lecturer at Brown University. He's also one of the co-founders and co-directors of the annual Jaipur Literature Festival. In conversation with him today is Mr. Avik Chanda. Avik is an accomplished author. His literary works have been published in many international journals. His latest
Hi,
book.
Avik.
Hi, William. Long time no see.
Hi, Avik. So, Avik's latest book, Dara Shuko, The Man Who Would Be King, has been on the national bestsellers list. Avik is also an entrepreneur and a visiting faculty at IIT Delhi and XLRI. Thank you, Avik, for being with us today.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
And now, my friend,
Samira and Avik, do you have my PowerPoint? And can we get that up on the visible?
yes, that PowerPoint is with us, and we'll put it up in as soon as you start the presentation.
Very good. Excellent.
Perfect.
I'll just have to say move or forward or something like that. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Fine.
And now, my friends, I'm happy to announce that we also have with us today our national president, Ms. Janvi Fukan. Welcome to Flow Kolkata, Janvi. It is indeed a pleasure to have you here with us today. As president of Flow, Janvi represents over 8,000 women entrepreneurs and professionals. She has made promoting economic empowerment and equal opportunities for women her life's mission. Janvi has also been involved with the rehabilitation of trafficked women and has worked with the artisans and weavers of Northeast India. Janvi is a recipient of the Flow Outstanding Women's Achievers Award and has founded 2 National Tourism Award-winning companies, Jungle Travels India and Assam Bengal Navigation Company. Janvi, can I please request you to address all of us here today?
Good evening, Kolkata. Kolkata, the city of joy and of eternal hope. I am delighted to welcome the Floridian historian, William Dalrymple, on behalf of the 17 chapter of the Ficci Flow that I represent as the national president. Mr. Dalrymple Flow is the oldest business house for women in South Asia, with 8,000 entrepreneurs, businesswomen, professionals, and the like. It's a matter of honor for me to be the first to hold this position from the land of the 7 sisters and 1 brother, which the Flow Northeast chapter represents. Mr. Dalrymple, you may recall visiting Mon and Wakching in Nagaland with your wife in 2016, and my company has some lovely pictures of that visit. Travel has now become a distant dream with the world having changed around us. We at Flow have learned to adapt quickly, to embrace technology, and today, our dramatically changed circumstances have in fact brought our 8,000 members closer together from different corners of our country. So here I am in Guwahati with the one and only William Dalrymple joining us from Delhi, and our moderator, Avik Chanda in Kolkata. Indeed, Kolkata could not have been a more befitting setting to listen to the man who has brought alive the story of the world's first corporation, the East India Company, which established itself in India with the infamous Battle of Plassey in Bengal, then one of the richest regions of the world. We would like to, I'm sorry, let's get there. With that, and it is as ironical that it was again in Bengal that with the great famine of Bengal and 10 million dead, that the East India Company finally met its nemesis and led to the British Crown finally conquering India. So that history was fascinating to learn from your books, and it comes alive in your recent book. I would also like to mention here that I understand Mr. William Dalrymple is a blood relative of the great Virginia Woolf, one of the great literary figures of English history, of English literature. So I would contend that behind every great man, there is a great woman, right? So while we are here, I now look forward to listening to Mr. Dalrymple. And before that, I want to congratulate Flow Kolkata chairperson, Sunita Chamaria, and her team for making this Adda possible. And a very warm welcome to all the members of the Flow Calcutta and the Flow Young Flow Calcutta who are here today. I would like to now request William Dalrymple to take us through his presentation. Thank you.
So I'm going to begin this talk on the East India Company a long way from India with this very English profile of Powys Castle rising up on a great knob of rock in the Welsh marches. And it looks the epitome of Englishness, crenellated walls rising up from Tudor box hedges. But go inside the tower and you'll find a very different world. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. So this is the main gallery of Powys Castle. And as you can see, it is filled with Indian treasures. There are swords and shields and talwars, elephant armor, ivory chessmen. Next slide. One or two quite major historical monuments, including this, which we're looking at now. If you go, that is the palanquin of Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, abandoned on the battlefield of Plassey. And if you were to go through the arch at the end of the picture, you would find yourself in the campaign tent of Tipu Sultan. Now, you might well ask, what is all this loot doing in the middle of the British countryside? Because this is a private house, quite a long way from anywhere in the middle of the countryside, and yet it is filled with more Mogul items of value than any one collection in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan. If you want to understand what this stuff is doing in the middle of the Welsh countryside, you should perhaps look at the picture which you have to pass under to lead into this treasure house, this khazana. Next slide. Could we be a bit quicker, please, with the slide, Jenny? Here we go. Yeah, this will keep things. No, that's right. So this, as the caption points out, is Shah Alam conveying the gift of the Diwani to Lord Clive. It's a picture by Benjamin West, and it's at Powys Castle, and it sits over the entrance to the treasure chamber, the chamber filled with loot. And remember that loot, of course, is a Hindustani word. Lutna, to plunder, was a word unknown in Britain until suddenly in the 18th century it became a part of common parlance in English. And And the reason it did so is the event that we are looking at in this picture. What is happening is that Shah Alam is handing a document to Lord Clive, who is the owner of Powis Castle. And that document is called the Diwani, which doesn't, of course, mean much to anyone in Britain or in India today. But what the Diwani was an act of, I suppose you would call it, involuntary privatization. And it gave the right to not the British government, but to a private company, the East India Company, to collect the taxes, to manage the mints and finances of the three richest provinces of the Mughal Empire. Now, today, of course, if you think of rich provinces of India, you might think of Maharashtra or Punjab or Gujarat, think of the West and the North. But in the 18th century, it was very emphatically the East, Calcutta, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, which were the focus of wealth in India. And the reason for that was the textile trade. Bengal had 1 million weavers, and those weavers were producing the world's best quality, most innovative, and most in-demand textiles that you would find anywhere. And the Mughal Empire at this point was the world's richest manufacturing force. Mughal India controlled 40% of the world's gross domestic product. For the first time since probably the Roman period, India was the world's largest manufacturer and the world's richest country. And I think, we've all been so, in a sense, indoctrinated by Bollywood that we think of the Mughals in terms of the Taj Mahal and Aishwarya Rai dropping pieces of mango into Hrithik Roshan's mouth, and we've romanticized and Bollywooded it. What we forget is that the Mughals' main achievement was to turn India into the world's leading manufacturer, with the leading share of GDP in the world, greater even than China. And so when you look at the Taj Mahal, really, you shouldn't really look at it as a monument of love, although it can be interpreted that way. It's also a monument, in a sense, to Indian manufacturing, and that's where the money came from. The reason that the East India Company was in India at all, or the French Compagnie des Indes, or the Portuguese, or the Dutch, or the Danes at Serampore, the French at Chandanagar, and so on, was this wealth. India was a spectacularly successful manufacturing hub, which is not, of course, how we usually think of the Mughal Empire. We think in terms of decadence and nawabs and palaces and tombs, but we're missing the point. This was a very, very rich country producing extraordinary goods. And this was the reason that the company came here in the first case. And over the next half hour, I'll be telling you the story of how it came to be that one English company from one small country on the edge of Europe, by no means at the time the company was founded was England or London the center of European commerce or European money making. Indeed, the opposite is true. England was something of a peripheral country to Europe in the end of the 16th century. And yet one company out of one building, next slide, please. You can have a look at the building that the East India Company was run out of. Could we have the next slide, please? Could whoever's managing the slides be a little bit more awake, or we won't get through this lecture. Here we go. Here is the next slide. This is the East India Company's headquarters in Leadenhall Street. As you can see, it's just 5 windows wide. It's no palace. It's just an office block. It's not even the 2 buildings on either side, the tall buildings which rise up to 4 stories. It's just the 3-story building in the middle. Out of that building, which at the time of the Battle of Plassey had only 35 permanent staff, out of that one building came the organization which succeeded in replacing the Mughal Empire as the primary power in India. A story, in fact, so improbable that if you suggested it as a Netflix plot, as a documentary for Netflix, I don't think anyone would believe it. How could one small business in one small capital in a street in London end up replacing the mighty Mogul Empire? But that's what happened, and I'll tell you over the next half hour how it happened. Okay, next slide. We're going to go back to the beginning of the story and go to the founding of the company. Now, this man, Sir Thomas Smythe, is the man who got the whole thing going. He's in some ways the kind of Vijay Mallya of Elizabethan England, son of a rich man, inherited a fortune, which he quickly increased. His father used to run the London customs. He used the money that his father had made to found the Levant Company, importing spices and currants from the Greek islands and from Aleppo and Cairo on the edge of the Arab world. And Sir Thomas Smythe did very well with this business and made a considerable sum of money until in 1598 he had a problem. The problem was that the Dutch had decided that they could take their boats round the Cape of Good Hope and sail directly to the spice manufacturers in Indonesia. That's the island of Run, a small island off, not so far from Bali, where the world's nutmeg came from. And these early Dutch voyages were so successful that they managed to produce spices in the European marketplace at a fraction of the cost of the spices that Smythe was buying from the Arabs, which of course had to pass through many middlemen on the way, pass over camel caravans through the Sinai, at each stage being marked up each time they changed hands. And the Dutch cut through all that. They just sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, bought the stuff directly from the producers, and produced fresher, larger quantities of spices at a fraction of the cost. And so Smythe could have just packed up and decided that this wasn't a business that was worth fighting the Dutch for, but instead he decided to take them on. And on the 22nd September, 1599, next slide, please, he called a public meeting and he gathered the, next slide, please, he gathered the worthies of London at a meeting at the Founders Hall in Moorgate Fields. Now, Moorgate Fields today is just a rather grubby tube station in the city of London near the Indian High Commission. Any of you that have gone to India House in London will have probably stopped at Moorgate Fields tube station. But in those days, Moorgate Fields were fields. They were agricultural area outside the main city of London. And in the middle of these fields was a large hall, which Smythe decided to hold the first meeting of the East India Company. And here is a list of the people who attended. We have all the details of this meeting, including the amount of money, which is what this list is, that the people gave who attended the meeting. And the first man's given, I think, £200. The next man's given 1,000. The Lord Mayor is the first name on the list. And it goes on for 15 pages, people subscribing money to the company. And initially, it's the big merchants and the big ship owners and the pirates and the privateers. But after a few pages, it moves from the kind of big money, £1,000, £500 donations to some small mum and dad businesses, people that describe themselves as vintners, skinners, haberdashers, and they're giving £5, £7, and so on, small amounts of money. But it's enough to found the company. And the next week, Smythe engages, next slide, please, a gentleman called Sir James Lancaster, who's just come back from the Moluccas, although he sunk the ship, top left of that picture, which took him and lost his crew to cannibals on the way back. So not necessarily the optimum choice of a man to run the first voyage, but there was no one else who'd been there. So he was the only choice. And he and Smythe went to Deptford, looked at a few ships. They rejected a creaky old hulk called the Mayflower, which of course then went on to play history traveling in the opposite direction. And instead they bought a boat called the Scourge of Malice, which sounds like it should be Jack Sparrow's flagship from Pirates of the Caribbean. But this, in fact, it was a real ship that existed. The company bought it, refitted it and renamed it, because obviously the Scourge of Malice was not quite the ID that they wished to give out for themselves. They were not pretending to be pirates. They wanted to be a respectable trading business. So they called the ship the Red Dragon. And in 1600, the voyage set off. Didn't have a very good start. Lancaster got becalmed off the coast of Dover, and people came and waved and laughed at the ship sitting there, unable to leave even the English Channel, never mind make it to India. But in due course, the wind picked up. They sailed all the way there. And just as they were coming to Indonesia, they found a Portuguese ship, a carrack, coming in the opposite direction. And as half the crew were pirates, and Lancaster was too, they simply raided the Portuguese ship, transferred the contents into their own hold, and then sailed home again. And they arrived back in 1601 and sold the contents of the ship, the spices that they'd taken from the Portuguese, for £1 million. This is obviously a vast sum of money in Elizabethan England, and was enough to power the East India Company for its first 30, 40 years, giving a huge profit to all of the investors who'd turned up at the meeting and promised money. However, the Dutch were always ahead of them. The Dutch had started a bit earlier. They had better financial instruments. They had better sailors than Sir James Lancaster. And when in 1630 or 40, the Dutch and the British East India Company came to blows over the spice trade, it was basically the Dutch who won the battle. And there was a treaty when the island of Run was handed over to the Dutch, the source of all the world's nutmeg. It seemed like a big defeat at the time. As a sop, the English were given a small muddy island in the middle of the Hudson River in North America called Manhattan, which obviously in the long term was a very good investment, but at the time it seemed like a bit of a defeat. And the company has to redesign itself like a new startup that isn't quite working. The company had to find a new business model. And instead of spices, they decided to focus in 1640 on textiles coming out of India. So they moved from being a spice business focused on what is today Indonesia to a textile business focused on what is now Bengal. And as I said earlier, Bengal was then the richest province of the Mughal Empire, the source of all the money that powered those magnificent Mogul buildings rising in Delhi and Agra and so on. And particularly it was the state-of-the-art Bengali textile trade, mainly simple white cottons produced with great high quality and extreme low cost, but also kalamkaris and silks and beautifully embroidered Mogul hangings, which were sought in Paris and Rome, across Europe. And soon the English East India Company is effectively becoming the shipping agency of the Moguls. They managed to get the edge on their competitors, and they are moving Mogul textiles around the globe. And they do this so successfully that by the 1660s, by the 1700s, there is actually deindustrialization in Mexico, as far away as Mexico, because the amount of cheap Bengali imports being sent over to the New World by the East India Company. Soon the company has enough money to build a new office. Next slide, please. And this is the wooden buildings of Leadenhall Street. Here is the facade. You can see pictures of ships on the front. This rather nice wooden hall where the company had its meetings and its annual general meeting. They also, at the same time, built a new dock for themselves where they built their East Indiaman boats. Next slide. Deptford. One can see the boats being constructed here at Deptford. Next slide, please. Here it is. The boats lined up in Deptford Dock. And all goes well for the company, which is now making a very considerable profit. And through, in a sense, its defeat by the Dutch in the spice trade, they're onto a much better thing with the rising textile trade. And this wasn't planned, but this is a happy accident that means that the company is rapidly becoming the world's most successful and biggest business. Next slide. And all goes well until Aurangzeb seen here on his battle horse, manages to overextend the Mughal Empire and provoke the Marathas into revolt. And Shivaji breaks out of his fortresses along the Western Ghats. He burns the Mughal port at Surat. 3 times, no less, he burns Surat. And simultaneously with the Maratha eruption, there come the risings of the Jats and the Doab and the Sikhs in the Punjab, and everything is beginning to fall apart. But in the middle of it, Delhi, next slide, is still the biggest city in the world. Next slide, please. Whoever's controlling the PowerPoint, please be a bit quicker because this is slowing everything up. Here we go. Here is the Red Fort in Delhi. And the Red Fort is at the center of Delhi, which is the Shah Jahanabad, the largest city, not just in the Mughal Empire, but in the world, and also the richest. Next slide, you've got an image of the Chandni Chowk, one of the most elegant boulevards in the world. Next slide, please, the Chandni Chowk. You can see here from the Lahore Gate of the Red Fort, looking down the Chandni Chowk. Today, a massive and overhead telegraph wires and so on. In those days, though, this beautiful main street with a canal running down the center of it. And everyone is wondering who's going to get their hands on Delhi if the Mughal Empire is losing power. Is it going to be the Marathas, who are moving ever closer northwards as they conquer Madhya Pradesh and take Gwalior and Indore and all the land that's now Madhya Pradesh? Is it going to be the Jats, who are closer near Agra? Is it going to be the Sikhs in the Punjab, who are raiding southwards? Everything is in flames. Everything is falling apart. But in the end, it's none of those. It's not even anyone from India. Next slide. Because at the same time as all these uprisings are taking place in India, this character, Nadir Shah of Persia, has just seized power in Isfahan. He's overturned the Safavid dynasty, and he's all set to come and, as he puts it, pluck some golden feathers from the Mogul peacock's tail. And he wants to basically loot India, to take the wealth. He doesn't want to rule it. He has no intention of coming to rule India. He just wants the cash to fight his real enemies, who are the Russians and the Ottoman Turks. So in 1739, he invades Afghanistan. He takes Kandahar, takes Kabul, comes down the Khyber Pass because there's no opposition, and he takes Peshawar and Lahore. At this point, the Mughals finally realize they've got a major problem. They call Nizam ul-Mulk, the governor of the Deccan, up from the south. They gather the armies from Awadh. The Nawab of Awadh comes and joins the emperor, who is Muhammad Shah Rangila, and they mass on the plains of Karnal, waiting for Nadir Shah. But it's a complete mess. The Mughal army is outdated. It hasn't got the latest military technology. All the girls from the sort of equivalent of whatever the Khan Market's 17th century equivalent was, were there sort of taking the equivalent of selfies in their Dior sunglasses. There's dancing girls, there's Delhi society people. Everyone is massing on the plains. And facing this, you have a much smaller army. There's 1 million Mughals, but there's only 150,000 Persians. But they are armed with the latest technology, which is the swivel gun, which is a huge jezail that can fire an enormous lead slug through any armor that the Mughals have. And the Mughals don't know about this technology. And Nadir Shah successfully lures the Mughals out of their camp by pretending to retreat. They then charge at him. At the last minute, the Persian heavy cavalry part like a curtain, and there are the Persian light cavalry, the Persian heavy cavalry waiting for the Mughals with their swivel guns. 5 minutes later, it's all over. One volley from the swivel guns, and the cream of Mughal chivalry lie dying on the fields of Karnal. That evening, next slide, Nadir Shah invites Muhammad Shah Rangila to dinner. Here is Muhammad Shah on the left and Nadir Shah in his hat on the right. And the idiot goes with only a small bodyguard. And Nadir Shah, who does not stand on honor, he's a self-made man, he has no interest in chivalry or anything else, simply arrests Muhammad Shah Rangila, and the next day he takes him into Delhi. 6 weeks later, he leaves again. With him, he takes the Kohinoor, the Peacock Throne, and 8,000 wagons filled with jewels and gold. 8,000 wagons. The entire loot of the Mogul Empire, everything the Moguls had gathered from around India, and before them the Delhi Sultans, is simply shipped off to Afghanistan, to Herat, in one fell swoop. And without the money, with the treasury completely empty, the Mogul Empire simply falls apart. There is no money to pay the civil service. There's no money to pay the army. And it's like you take a great Baroque mirror and you throw it out a third floor window. It shatters into a million pieces. Each one of the Rajput states, Udaipur, Jodhpur, Jaipur, the Maratha states, like Gwalior and Pune, Nagpur, the southern states like Tanjore, everything splits up and becomes independent. Marathas, Nizam of Hyderabad becomes independent. And where before you had one unitary state with 4 million men under arms, now you have hundreds of little states competing against each other. And culturally, this is a very good thing. This is the period of Nine Sukh and the great Bahari paintings. This is the period of the rise of both Hindustani and Carnatic classical music. This is the great period of dance, wall paintings, some of the finest palaces in Rajasthan are built about now. But in terms of defense, India is now got a divided polity. Everyone is up for themselves. Everyone's army is, as a result, much smaller. Next slide. And the people to take advantage of this are the two rival East India companies, the French and the British. Now, this may look like a sort of gay pride parade, but this is the latest in 18th century military technology. These are the Madras sepoys, dressed up in imitation of the French. The French, of course, invented these natty little voguey shorts are the sepoys are wearing. And while the Marathas have been raiding India and the Mughal Empire has been splitting up, there's been a military revolution taking place in Europe. Frederick the Great has invented a new form of warfare based on infantry with socket bayonets, file firing, a horse artillery that can be moved around a battlefield at speed, new 18th century developments in ballistics and grape shot and explosive shells. And all this technology, which has revolutionized warfare in Europe, is brought to India by first the French, who in 1740 defeat a large Mughal army from the Nawab of the Carnatic. 40,000 Carnatic Mughal cavalry troopers are sent packing by a small group of 200 Pondicherry sepoys. And suddenly everyone realizes that warfare is never going to be the same again. And the sepoy and the infantry maneuver is what dominates warfare now for the next century. And for the next 40 years, no one can defeat the company sepoys. It takes Indian forces 40 years to match this military technology. But between 1740 and 1780, there's absolutely nothing any Indian force can do really to take on a fully armed, fully prepared company army. Now, the first man to feel the heat on this and the feat is Siraj Ud-Dowla, next slide, of Bengal. In 1756, he raids Calcutta and he takes Calcutta, throws the survivors into the black hole of Calcutta, where many of them die. And this is because the company has very arrogantly rebuilt the fortifications without seeking his permission. And Siraj Ud-Dowla, who is a kind of nasty little psycho, contrary to what you've read in your textbooks, his cousin describes him as a bisexual psycho rapist. That's Ghulam Hussain Khan in the Sayar Mutakarreen gives a very unpleasant description of this man. Siraj Ud-Dowla takes Calcutta, but he does it with incredibly bad timing, because the same day that the news of the fall of Calcutta reaches Madras, next slide, a British Marine force turns up under a man called Robert Clive, seen in the next slide in his red coat. Here he is. Robert Clive is also a kind of nasty little psycho, well matched for Siraj ad-Dowlah. He is a sort of village delinquent from Shropshire who has revolutionized warfare in the company armies by breaking all the rules. He attacks at night and fog during thunderstorms. He's very aggressive. And Clive has turned up due to an error of intelligence, rather like the faulty intelligence which led to the Iraq War, the famous dodgy dossier. Clive has come to India chasing a French fleet, which intelligence has led the East India Company to believe has sailed for Bengal. In fact, that French fleet sailed for Canada, the opposite direction. But they don't know that. So they arrive in Madras, find no French fleet, but instead they hear that Siraj ad-Dowlah has taken Calcutta. So Clive seizes his moment and says, we must retake Calcutta, our honor is at stake, our trade is at stake, the company's share price is at stake. And he sails up the east coast of India into the Hooghly, retakes Calcutta, then destroys Chandanagar, and he's about to go back to Madras in case the French do finally turn up. And at that point, he gets a letter from a man called the Jagat Seth. Now, the Jagat Seth is the leading Marwari businessman and banker in Bengal, a brilliant financier who's invented new methods of money transfer, which allows the tax revenue of Bengal to be sent up to Delhi virtually by hundi, rather than literally by moving it into crates and onto carts and moving it all the way from Bengal to Shahjahanabad. And the Jagat Seth takes 10% on this transaction, this money transfer. Money's paid into his office in Murshidabad and it's withdrawn in Shahjahanabad. And every year he just takes a 10% cut. He also takes a cut on the minting of the Mughal rupee, which he produces for the eastern half of the country. And he has, in the process of a generation, become the richest man in India. What the Rothschilds will be in Europe in the 19th century, remind me to turn on the sound at the end. And the Jagat Seth sends a message to Clive saying, if you get rid of Siraj ad-Dowlah, I will pay you £2 million personally, and I will pay the company £2 million in commission. And Clive, without even bothering to check with Madras, never mind London, does exactly this. He sends the money. He takes the money and he marches north to Murshidabad. And at the Battle of Plassey, there is the famous battle in British textbooks. Next slide, it's shown to be this heroic battle of English valor defeating the massed ranks of the Moguls. But in actual fact, it's a big setup because Mir Jafar, next slide, the general of Siraj ad-Dowlah, Mir Jafar is also in the pay of the Jagat Seth and is part of the conspiracy. Next slide, please. We need to see Mir Jafar. And towards the end of the Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar simply walks off the battlefield and leaves Siraj ad-Dowlah exposed. Siraj flees the battlefield, is caught, killed, and 5 days later, Clive walks into the treasury at Murshidabad and simply helps himself to the jewels. He stuffs his pockets, literally. When he's later questioned about this in Parliament, he replies, "My lords, I was astonished at my own moderation." And he then takes the entire contents of the Murshidabad treasury, loads it in barges, and floats it downstream to Calcutta. And in this way, the East India Company gains dominance in Bengal with just one battle. 7 years later, there's a second battle. Next slide. Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor, has joined up with the Nawab of Awadh, Shuja-ud-Dawla, and the new Nawab of Bengal. And the three of them launched an attack on the company, wanting to drive the company out of India. Next slide, please. You can see Shah Alam lying on his divan down here. The Battle of Buxar is another company victory in 1764. And suddenly the company finds that there is no one left in North India who can defeat it. It has defeated the Moguls and it has replaced the Mughal Empire. And it doesn't take long for the company to begin to change its behavior. Now they've got no one to please. The British government is not carefully watching what's going on. They're just very happy to take the tax and customs revenue. This, after all, is a private company. This is not the British government. And you know, the Victorians were embarrassed by the mercantile beginnings of their Raj and rather sort of downplayed the independence of the company, which I think Indian historians have continued to do. But this is, you know, the East India Company was a separate from the British government, as Facebook or Google or Twitter are separate today from the American government. You know, it's an independent joint stock company. It was, in fact, the first joint stock company, the first to this new sort of business operation. Now that it controls North India, it can do two things. The first of all, it can start planting opium. And it uses this opium to sell to the Chinese to buy China tea, which is now growing in popularity in Europe. And they sell the tea in China, the Chinese tea in India, in Europe, and in America. They also use the money to enlarge their army. Next slide. They move from 20,000 sepoys to 40,000 to 100,000. Here are the first generation of sepoys. But by 1799, next slide, you can see there are many, many, many different regiments all lined up. Next slide, please. Here we are. This is it. The different East India Company regiments in 1799. And at this period, the company has a private army of 200,000 troops at a time when the British government only has 100,000 troops. In other words, this private company has a larger army by a factor of 2 than the British government itself. I mean, an astonishing turn of history. And this private army of brown Indian sepoys, not white imported soldiers like in the Raj, but this is an Indian army of Indian sepoys, is paid for by Indian bankers like the Jagat Seth and Gopal Das, the great Sets and bankers of Allahabad and Patna. So the company's pulled off this incredible trick. It's conquered India using Indian troops paid for by Indian capital. Why do the Jagat Sets and the bankers lend to the company? Because unlike the Moguls, the company is a corporation. It understands about interest, repaying on time with interest. That it's not a favor, that it's an essential part of business to repay your debt. So it has a sort of AAA credit rating, if you like, in modern terms. And the bankers are delighted to do business with it. However, delightful that they may be as as debtors who repay their money on time, the company now, untrammeled by worries about the Moguls or anyone else, it begins quite literally to asset strip Bengal. And in this period, individual company men are shipping home often £1 million a year each. I mean, there are vast sums of money. When you go to England and you see one of those beautiful 18th century Georgian country houses in the hands of the National Trust, usually today, with tea rooms and so on, and looks like Colin Firth might stride out in his breeches and sort of paddle through a stream on his way to meet some Jane Austen heroine. When you see those buildings, they are built with money shipped out of India at this point by the East India Company. It's also built, of course, on the product of slavery and the Caribbean slave trade, which is the other great stream of income coming into Britain at this point. But the company is half of it. And the company now is a global multinational. Next slide. It's growing. Here's Colonel Todd taxing the land revenue. It's assessing land across Hindustan and taxing people for it. With the profits, it buys its what it calls its investment, which means the textiles that it's going to trade, whatever else it's going to sell in Europe. And so it no longer has to import bullion from England to buy textiles. It just taxes Indians and spends the taxes on textiles, which it then sells at a profit. It's a brilliant business model. Next slide. It also, as I said, grows opium, which it sells in China and sells in India, in Europe, and in America. And this is the Boston Tea Party. And here is the East India Company tea being poured into Boston Harbor because America is also one of the great destinations of China tea, one of the sources of East India Company wealth. By this stage, the company has its own flag. Next slide, which became the model for the American flag. Next slide, please. And it also has an enormous palatial headquarters in Leadenhall Street. Next slide. The old wooden building we saw earlier, then the 5-window wide office block that we saw later has been replaced. Next slide, by this extraordinary palace the size of Buckingham Palace. Inside, next slide, the director's boardroom is the room from which India is ultimately controlled. Next slide, please. The boardroom here is, if you like, what Racecourse Road is today, where Mr. Modi sits and makes his decisions. In those days, it's from an office block in London. Next slide. Meanwhile, the company is increasing its fleet. It has one dock in the East India docks where Canary Wharf is today, and it has another dock where it builds its East India Companymen at Brunswick. Next slide. And by this stage, it's building 700 clippers a year to ship textiles, tea, and opium across the globe. So it's now turned from this small, stumbling English business into this vast multinational corporation that's richer than most countries. And like Amazon today, which is Amazon's profit today is 1 trillion already. The entire GDP of India, to compare with that, is 3 trillion. In other words, Amazon alone is worth about 1/3 of all the manufacturers of modern India. In the same way, in the 18th century, the East India Company was richer than most states, and it knows it can do anything it wants. Not only does it have a bigger army than Great Britain, it has the ability to bribe MPs. And the first ever case of corporate bribery takes place in 1697, within a century of the founding of the company, when the company is caught offering share options to MPs. The company goes on to invent corporate lobbying, like the same sort of thing that Tata and Reliance and Exxon Mobil in DC and so on get up to today, this business of changing government policy because of corporate need. This is an East India Company invention. This is the legacy of the East India Company. It also simply stuffs Parliament with its returned nabobs. These guys who've shipped home £1 million spend their money first on a country house, then on a rotten borough so that they can enter Parliament. And all this is a very nice little earner. Money is pouring into Britain. The government doesn't care because it's providing half the tax revenue for the country and 1/3 of the customs. It is a massive boon to Great Britain, but it is also, of course, asset stripping, plundering, and looting India at the same time. And people in India know this. Ghulam Hussain Khan, the great chronicler, writes about how his Mogul ancestors may have looted and pillaged, he says, but they at least spent their money within India. The difference with the East India Company, he realizes, is that the profits go abroad. The East India Company doesn't build red forts and Taj Mahals in India using Indian businessmen. It ships the money home and employs English craftsmen in the home counties to build massive palaces for its nabobs. So all this is looking very profitable, but like any greedy company, it gets too big for its boots. And in 1770, only 6 years after the Battle of Buxar, it presides over the worst famine in Indian history, the Bengal famine of 1770, when 5 million Bengalis die of starvation. Now, unlike traditional Mogul or Indian rulers who set aside grain for rainy days, for famines, and who, if a famine does occur, they use their resources to provide famine relief work for unemployed laborers. The company is a corporation. It doesn't see its job to look after Indians or to care for migrant laborers. It's just there to make a profit. And the sepoys are sent out into the provinces where men are dying in the thousands and just erect gibbets. And if anyone, even if they're starving, doesn't pay their full tax revenue, they're simply hung. So when the East India Company discovers that the taxes have been gathered in full, despite the famine, the shareholders shockingly vote an increased dividend for themselves from 10 to 12.5%, while 5 million Bengalis die of famine. It's an incredible tale of corporate greed. But it is the source of the company's demise, because in 1770, they managed to get full revenue by simply looting and sending the sepoys out. But by 1772, there's nothing left to extract. They've literally asset stripped Bengal, cleaned it dry, picked the bone clean. And in 1774, the news comes that there is no revenue coming in from Bengal because everyone is dead or dying and starving. And the company's share price drops and there is a run on the banks. It's like the subprime collapse of 10 years ago, but much worse. 30 banks collapse across Europe. The chairman of the company goes bankrupt, as do many others. And the company has to go first to the Bank of England, then to the Parliament to bail it out. And eventually in 1774, in the Regulating Act, the state, Great Britain, buys into the company. And it changes from being a libertarian, unregulated libertarian company that can do what it likes to becoming what we today would call a public-private partnership, because the government owns half the shares. They bailed it out and they now have a controlling influence. So they now appoint the Governor General. And what you see over the next 50 years is a gradual diminution in the commercial element of the company as it gradually becomes more and more of a Sarkari hand of the state, less interested in profits, more interested in government. And in due course, its commercial qualities, its commercial function is completely rolled up in 1830, and it becomes just a governing corporation. Still nominally owned by the shareholders, but no longer trading, just governing India. And then in 1857, next slide, there is the final act when the great uprising breaks out, and what in Britain is still called the Indian Mutiny, but which here is called the First War of Independence, breaks out. And in the aftermath, Delhi is stormed. Next slide. And maybe 100,000 are killed in the very bloody hangings and retributions which follow. It's a horrible episode, but it's too big a mess to be disguised by the company. Everyone in Britain is following the news. The first ever war correspondent, William Howard Russell, is sent out by the Times to cover it. And he reports the complete mess, with sepoys being blown from the mouths of cannon. Delhi is empty because the whole population has been deported. And it's such a mess that in 1858, the company is finally nationalized and rolled up, and the British Raj begins. But the strange thing is that we know all about the British Raj. We know about Kipling and Curzon and all those guys in empire building shorts marching around in pith helmets and so on. But we've forgotten really about the company. The company, though, was around for much longer. The Raj lasts only 90 years, from 1858 to 1947. But the East India Company was around for 250 years. And it is the company which created British rule in India, and it is the company which extracted Indian wealth for the benefit of Great Britain, or rather for the benefit of its shareholders, who were largely British. But why did the Indians support this? Why did the Marwari bankers pay for this? Why did sepoys join its army to fight their brethren? The answer is the company was very clever about making itself acceptable to Indian rule. So the Calcutta is like Dubai or Singapore today. It was a tax-free port. That's why the Mawaris went there, because they didn't have to pay tax. They could make as much money as they liked, and the East India Company didn't tax them. Later, when the company, after Buxar, begins to break up the big Mughal Jagirs, it auctions them off. Who buys it? The Maliks, the Tagores, the Debs, the Badralog. And the Bengali Badralog also buy into the company in terms of company bonds. When the company goes to war, it needs to raise money. It puts up bonds which offer enormous high levels of repayment if you lend to the company, and the Badralog invest in that. So when you go around all those gorgeous North Calcutta mansions next Pujo and go and see those gorgeous mansions, they are built on money made with the company by the Badralog who are in business with them. It's a profitable business, and enough Bengalis make the choice that the company is the least worst option when the other two options are the Marathas who raped and pillaged Bengal in the 1740s. That's why the Maratha ditch was built. Or the Mughals, who they've been ruled for a century and then now they've had enough of. So as far as the Bengalis are concerned, the company may asset strip and loot, but it's the least worst option when the other two options are the Marathas and the Moguls. Next slide. I'll just end. This is the breakup of the company with, this is the East India Company house being blown from the mouth of a cannon in the Punch cartoon that marks the end of the company. You can see the banners as East India Company house is blown from the mouth of the cannon. The documents flying in the air read nepotism, avarice, misgovernment, and blundering. Next slide. I'll just end with the impeachment of Warren Hastings. This is the one moment that the British Parliament actually takes the company to court for corruption and abuse of its powers. Unfortunately, they get the wrong guy, because actually Warren Hastings is the most decent of all the Governor Generals, much better than a crook like Clive. But I'm just going to end with the quote, important quote from the Lord Chancellor, which opens the trial of Warren Hastings. He stands up at the bar in Westminster Hall and he says, "My lords, ladies and gentlemen, companies, corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like." Thank you very much.
Okay, lovely. So, William, I was saying that last time we met was at the Bangalore Times of India Litfest in Feb, where I really enjoyed your presentation on the company paintings. This was in a, particularly if we got to the latter part of the presentation, a much darker tone. So it was not just fascinating, but gripping, terrifying, really, the level of exploitation and manipulation that went on. So the way that we're going to proceed with this Adda is over the next 20-25 minutes. We're going to have a huge number of rapid fire questions coming at you. In fact, so many that we've actually had to ration them. So without further ado, Janabi, why don't you go ahead with the first question?
All right. Thank you. Mr. Dalrymple, that was absolutely fascinating. The way you've taken up the story of East India Company and that perspective that you have shown, that really it was the world's largest global corporation, and how they managed to rule from that building of 5 windows wide and take over one of the oldest civilizations. So many learnings. But in all this, since you had with your deep understanding of India's history, what was the role of the women then? Was there any women or a number of women who could have changed the course of our history, or who had gone against the grain? Were they women who would come to your mind who could have played that? What is the woman's narrative in that? I would like to know.
So Mogul women were much more powerful, I think, than people are aware. The person to read about this is somebody I would recommend very much for a Ficci talk, Ruby Lal, who is based in Atlanta. She's written 3 books on Mogul women and is the expert, and everything that I'm about to say comes from her work. I think colonial historians and particularly those on the Hindu right followed them, tended to see the Mogul women as entirely sexualized objects, as inhabitants of harem who were there entirely for pleasure. That isn't at all the reality. Mogul women, particularly senior begums, were enormously powerful figures. And in a world where the men and the princes were often battling with each other, every generation, the sons would fight for control when a father died. It was often the grandmother who would make peace, bring people together. When Akbar and Jahangir fall out with each other, it's the aunt who acts as the mediator. And important for marriage alliances, obviously Akbar's marriage to all the Rajputs is what brings the Hindu Rajputs in as the main battle axe of the Moguls. Again, I mean, there's a view again on the Hindu right that the Moguls are this sort of predatory, marauding force that sweep down from Central Asia, destroying everything in front of it, all the Hindu kings. The reality is, of course, that by the 16th century, when the Moguls turn up, there's already been sultanates across the whole of India, from Gujarat to Bengal down to Madurai. And it is Rajput armies at the front line of the Moguls who conquer these different sultanates. So Bijapur, Golconda, and so on are defeated by largely Rajput armies, which is why today, if you want to see nice Deccani painting, it's a good idea to go to Bikaner, because the Bikaner forces were the ones who raided the library at Bijapur. So you have Rajput armies looting Muslim libraries. So it's a very different thing from the kind of RSS version of it. But women are powerful. In the East India Company, you have big women investors, and as you know from Jane Austen, there's a lot of wealthy widows and so on in English society at this point. And there is a study that there are articles which I've read which make the point of a disproportionate number of women investors in the company, but no women, as far as I'm aware, were ever executives in the company. It was very much a male organization in terms of, and for that reason, you have English and, well, not just English, British men, a lot of Scots too, coming out to Bengal and falling in love with the gorgeous Bengali women. With the result that in the 1780s, Calcutta is about 1/3 Anglo-Indian, a forgotten moment in Calcutta. And you have massive intermarriage because the British take very much to the forebearers of Ficci in the city with dramatic results on the city population, shall we?
Thanks for that.
So, with that, Surya, do you want to go with your question?
Yes, I think that was really, really interesting. But in the context of the large corporations and multinationals and the fear of them interfering in the political process, in the true will of the people, do you think this is something that can happen today, or is it something that's just something that could happen then, or all of that could revisit us? Is there a lesson in history for us?
So, Nira, I don't know which world you're living in if you think that corporations are not influencing politics today. If you think the Reliance and Tata had nothing to do with the election victory of our beloved Mr. Modi, you're living in a different India to the one I live in, I'm afraid. No, of course, corporations, not just in India, but in Britain and America and all democracies, play a massive role. And the corporate donations are of how democracy works, how elections are fought. And from the time of the company, there's always been this thing of unspoken pro quid quos. You give a corporate donation to support a political party that you favour, and in some way you expect repayment of some sort, whether in terms of policy or in terms of direct pro quid quos, ports being opened, environmental restrictions being lifted, and so on and so on. So, no, I mean the world where spectrum is for sale, where coal can be mined, where ports are built, where this is the world we're very familiar with in modern India, where political parties, frankly, can be bought, is a world created by the East India Company, and arguably is the East India Company's final kiss of death to India.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So, William, we're going to proceed with some of the questions coming in from our live viewers. And one that you see on your screen is saying, tell us something more about your working style. So if I can add my 2 pence on that, there was this presentation interview that you did maybe like 10 years ago, where you talked about your writing process and likened it to Chinese cooking, if I remember correctly. Do you still see it that way?
Sure. So when I mean, obviously I write different sorts of books and they have different processes, but the 4 big history books were all very much alike. My first was White Moguls, then Last Moguls, then Return of a King, and finally the Anarchy. This is the quartet on the transition from Mogul rule to the company and up to the birth of the Raj. That quartet is now complete. Incidentally, I should mention my greatest collaborator for this was a wonderful translator called Bruce Winnell, who died in January of very galloping pancreatic cancer, without whom I'm much bereft, both personally and professionally. But he did an incredible job, and we just managed to complete that quartet before he died. So I'm now going to be doing something different, which I thought a question ask you what I'm doing now. To give you a quick answer about my methodology, I basically spend the year after I publish a book, which is the situation I'm in at the moment, going on a book tour and thinking about what I'm going to do next, reading the secondary material that's available on the subject. And then for the next 2 years, it's into the archive, particularly the Indian National Archive on Rajpath, and the British Library in London, where the 2 principal repository of East India Company and Persian sources for the period.
Right.
And then I sit down at home and I work through this. Bruce gets on with the Persian translations, the Persian sources. The Moguls wrote fantastic history, very little of which is read today. And the reason for this is that no one in this country reads Persian anymore. Persian was the language of government in this country from the 1200s until the 1830s. And there are literally a handful of people left in India that can read Hindustani Persian. A generation ago, many of your grandfathers, I'm sure, would have been able to read Persian fluently. But the art and the skill has gone, which means that if you can get access to this material, you gain access to the first-person version of the Mogul version, which otherwise is lost. You're just using colonial English sources. And it's very much been at the center of this quartet that I've written to get those Mogul sources translated and get the Mogul point of view, so that you don't just get a British version of events.
Right.
Once I'm sitting down at home, I put it all into card indexes. I have one box for people, one box for places, one box for random topics, and I have a date line which grows to about 600 pages with references on hand for every event. So the Battle of Plassey, I'll have about 15 or 20 pages of quotes from different sources, all in one place, all ready, cut up and diced, And this is a very slow and painstaking process, hence the comparison with Chinese cooking. You're moving slowly through the sources, cutting them up, dicing them, and marinating them, so to speak.
Right.
And then when you actually come to write it, it's hopefully very quick. You just shove it into the wok, stir fry it, and 9 months later a book appears. That's the idea.
Lovely. William, another question for you. Of late, there's this tendency amongst certain factions, which will go unnamed, to rewrite history. So Akbar is no longer great. Tipu Sultan should be taken off the history books. Dara Shikoh, good for him, is resurrected and almost recoronated, right? What's your view on all this?
So people have always understood history through the prism of the present. This has happened throughout human history. As the present changes, the view of the past changes with it, and that is entirely legitimate as long as it's based on historical primary sources. To give you an example from my own work, the collapse of the company when it went bankrupt in 1770 was something which is barely written about in most sources because the British government bailed it out. But after the subprime collapses of 10 years ago, suddenly it's something we understand. This way, the whole business of pandemics, I'm sure historians writing history in future over the next 10 or 15 years will be far more aware of plagues and pandemics than they have been up to now. It's something that suddenly seems relevant and important. So to look at history with fresh eyes from the point of view of the present is something that's always happened. It's not a new tendency. It's not something restricted to India. But it has to be based on real historical sources, not on political prejudice or racial prejudice or religious prejudice. And just because you don't like Hindus or Muslims or Jains or Buddhists or whatever your particular prejudice may be, take your pick, or don't like black people or white people or brown people, doesn't mean you can just make stuff up. And there's been a bit of that going on lately.
Yeah, absolutely. Question from Shruti Mala, and she's talking about whenever because your books are so engaging, at times it feels almost as if you can see those characters appear in front of you from life, right? So are they all completely factually based, or is there a little bit of imagination flowing into them?
So this is a question I only ever get asked in India. And the reason is that so many of your historians are so fabulously boring. I'm sorry to say this, but Indian academics have over the last 50 years had a genius for killing off the most exciting and wonderful historical stories in the world. And I think that's partly due to the fact that there was this very strong leftist take in most Indian academia.
Yes.
And in the leftist understanding of history, the Marxist understanding of history, what matters is economic and social forces, not individuals. With the result that characters and individuals have been weeded out from Indian history and replaced with unseen economic and social processes, which doesn't make for very readable history. I'm writing exactly the sort of history that anyone else writes anywhere else in the world. With you know, I take in economic and social forces, but I also take in the factor of individual personalities. You know, obviously the present would be different if Amit Shah and Mr. Modi did not exist. There we have an example of a particular combination of characters that, for better or worse, whether you love them or hate them, have changed the nature of modern India. It's a very clear, plus the third personality of Rahul Gandhi as someone perceptibly weaker and less commanding. And the conjunction of those three personalities has done much to form the present. We know that from our experience, from our understanding of the present. Mm-hmm. We also know that unseen economic forces are at work, the growth of the economy or the recessions or whatever it is. And you know, when we try to understand our present, we try and balance that. The trick to do that is, you know, to do it in the past too. to answer the question, is there any fictionalization? There's no fictionalization at all. This is very strictly history, but it's just using biography. It's using letters and people's notes, and also using art. A lot can be told from images, from whether they're Mogul miniatures or 18th century pictures by Tilly Cattle sitting in the Victoria Memorial Museum.
Right.
These are all very important sources that allow us to have a clearer picture of the past.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, William, when you're talking about paintings, I suddenly just remembered this is very interesting parallel in the last Mughal, where you're talking about the very celebrated portrait of Bahadur Shah Zafar, right? And then there is the portrait of one of his sons. Very different characters, swarthy, macho, very sort of militaristic, and even on the basis of bring out the contrast, saying this is the father and this is the son, is far more belligerent potentially, right?
Correct. And this is when we try and understand the present, when we try and understand the people in our family or our friends or enemies or colleagues, personality and character obviously are things that we take in. It should be the same when we're trying to understand the past.
Absolutely. Well, as you know, history is sort of replete with the what-if questions. So one of the questions that we have from Shraddha is, we talked about the momentous battle of Plassey and then of Buxar. So if either of these didn't happen or happened in a different way, would the entire sort of history be different or materially different in your view?
Yes, I do. I mean, there was never any certainty that the company would win. And several times they came very, very close to losing. We know they won, and we have, when we read history, we do so knowing that the company, in the sense, won in the end until it was nationalized. But at the time, no one knew that, and there are many occasions when if things have gone slightly differently. Buxar, for example, was a very close shave. The British thought they'd lost Buxar, and it was only when the Sujudawla prematurely declared victory and all his generals left their posts that the whole thing went to pieces. Ditto, there's two other occasions in the book that the company very nearly lost. One was after the Battle of Polilur, when the company was defeated by Tipu in 1789, is it? The Battle of Polilur, 1780, the Battle of Polilur. There's a massive defeat of the company, and the survivors fall back in disarray to Madras. Now, if Hyder Ali and Tipu had had the confidence to pursue them, there was nothing to stop them taking Madras, and they would have had control of South India. But they didn't have the confidence to raid Madras, and so they never took full advantage of that victory. Ditto in the final battle in the book in 1803, when the company is confronted by the Marathas. If Scindia and Holkar had formed a united front, it would have been a very, very unlikely outcome for the company to win, because they were very nearly defeated by both Scindia and Holkar working separately. But Scindia did not join with Holkar. We've seen in politics this year what happens when Scindia desert their allies. The same happened in the 19th century. And so, I mean, the company won by the skin of its teeth several times.
Indeed. What we'll do is we'll make this maybe the penultimate question from Manjari. Which period of Indian history fascinates you the most, and why?
Well, for 20 years, I've written about the same period, which is the space between the Moguls and the Raj. Between Aurangzeb's death in 1707 and the Great Uprising of 1857. And the four books, The White Mogul, Last Mogul, Return of a King, and most recently, The Anarchy. And that is, it's a fascinating period, partly because so few people have written about it. It's the forgotten period. People write about the great Moguls. They write about the Raj. There's tons of stuff on Curzon. There's tons of stuff on Shah Jahan. But in between that, you've got this extraordinary period when India is ruled by a corporation and for profit. That's the period that is always interesting me. Also, it's a very different period socially to the Raj. We're so fixated with this image of, the East is East and West is West, which was true for the Raj proper, that we have forgotten the incredible intermixture which took place and the mingling which took place in the East India Company, which is the subject of White Mogul, a period when 1/3 of British men in India were married to Indian, largely Bengali women. I think that has hugely changed both British and Bengali culture. The Bengalis remain the last Anglophiles in the country, I think.
Indeed, and that sort of continues to the day. We sometimes call ourselves the brown sahibs.
Well, there's a good reason for that. Many of you, unknown to yourselves, I think, have more European blood than you realize, genetically. I certainly have a great deal of Bengali blood when I had my blood tested, so it runs in both directions. I have a great-great-grandmother from Chandanagar.
Right. So we're coming towards the end of our program, and we'll have Janavi ask you the final question and then wrap up. Over to you, Janavi.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Dalrymple, you have taken us through such a vast course of history, and one can listen to you all night, but we do need to wrap up. But I have a question for you. Ever you go beyond the Mughal into the British Raj, I hope you...
No, I'm not planning to do that. I have a huge dislike of those characters like Curzon and Kipling. What I'm doing instead is going earlier, my next project is a look at the diffusion of Indian ideas around first Asia, then the world in the early period. So Buddhism going north into China, Hinduism to Southeast Asia, and Indian mathematical and astronomical ideas going westwards, first to Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate, and then from there in Fibonacci. The mathematician Fibonacci was the man who introduced Indian numerals to Europe. And he did so because he was born and brought up in Algeria, where there was a peasant trading post that his father was part of. And so the whole story of... So I think this is a period that again is oddly unwritten.
Yeah, it's such a vast topic, I know. But the Northeast is poorer without getting your storytelling for the subjugation of the hill tribes, of the opium trade, the tea industry.
Well, I'm very fond of your homeland. Guwahati is one of my favorite parts of India, and I've had many happy explorations around Kamakya and Kaziranga and so on. And I would love to write more, but I don't think there's going to be actually much. I'm afraid much Assam in the next book. There's quite a lot of the Anarchy. There's a little bit of Assam in the Anarchy, and a great deal of. Half the book is about Bengal.
And sure, I would. And please give us the woman's narrative too. We need the women's story coming out.
The woman's narrative.
More of the woman's perspective should come out more. Anyway, thank you very much.
You'll find the women's perspective in my book, White Moguls, most prominently, because Taranisa is a central character in that. So if you want some women's history, that's the one I would point you towards.
Okay, I will.
Yeah. So that was an absolutely fascinating conversation. William, thank you. We'll have Manjari wrap things up and then we're good to go.
Thank you, Avi. A very good evening to all our viewers. It's my honor to present a vote of thanks on behalf of Ficci Ladies Organisation, Calcutta Chapter. Mr. William Dalrymple, your name itself lights up a face as it reminds me of the name from a fairy tale. Thank you for enriching our members with your vast knowledge and enlightening us with our country's history. A big thank you to Mr. Avik Chanda for adding so much vigor and light to today's session. It's an absolute honor to have both of you with us today, along with our national president, Ms. Janvi Fukan. Janvi ji, it is a privilege to work under your leadership this year. Your vision, mission, and determination is an inspiration to all. We would also like to thank Ms. Malvika Banerjee from the Calcutta Literary Meet for her support for this event. To our sponsors, Damodar Ropeways and Infra Limited.
Malvika is watching. Hi, Malvika.
Thank you for standing by us. Our media partners and Mark for their help always. Our past presidents and past chairpersons for their vital guidance. To Team Flow and for their enthusiasm, and especially to Manisha and Ritu for the coordination for today's event. And most importantly, to our viewers, our members, for attending this virtual session today and helping us nurture your inner spark. Together, let's light up the world. Have a great evening, everyone, and thank you once again.
In these times of distress caused by coronavirus, we at Flow Kolkata have decided to felicitate our guests with a donation towards free meals and food relief on their behalf. In this regard, we have chosen Akshay Patra to execute the same. Akshay Patra and their supporting organizations have served over 60 million free meals so far. I now request our national president, Janvi, to felicitate William and Avik.
Thank you. This beautiful idea that our young chapter has. So the certificate will be shown to you. Can we see the certificate, please?
Yes. Thank you.
This is
how many free meals is that? 200 meals. Very good.
That's 200 meals from your side, and one for Avik Chanda. Can we see that? Thank you. This is for Avik Chanda. 100 meals. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Flo, you all have done a great job and been wonderful talking to you. We could talk all night.
How many people are watching this out of interest? Do we know a number?
I think we have about 150. Is that correct?
How wonderful.
And of course, we would have more checking on YouTube, right?
Yeah, so William, the way that this platform works, right, is we've got it hooked up on Facebook Live and YouTube.